Security cameras caught someone breaking into the Smithsonian's Sammy Davis Jr. exhibition at 3 a.m. They weren't after money or jewels. They wanted his dance shoes. When police caught the thief, what they discovered made everyone cry. It was March 15, 1995, 5 years after Sammy Davis Jr.'s death, and the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History was hosting a special exhibition called Sammy Davis Jr., A Life in Entertainment. The display featured costumes from his Vegas shows, photographs with the Rat Pack, gold records, and his Tony Award. But the centerpiece of the exhibition was a pair of black leather tap shoes, worn and scuffed from decades of performances, sitting in a climate-controlled glass case. These weren't just any shoes. They were the ones Sammy had worn during his legendary 1966 performance on The Ed Sullivan Show, the same shoes he'd tap-danced in during his final concert at the Sands Hotel in 1989. The placard read, "These shoes carried Sammy Davis Jr. through over 10,000 performances across 5 decades of entertainment history." At 3:17 a.m., the museum's security system detected motion in the American Entertainment Wing. Night security guard Robert Martinez immediately checked the monitors and saw something that made no sense. A man in his 50s wearing worn clothes and a baseball cap was standing in front of Sammy's display case. He wasn't grabbing expensive items or looking for an easy exit. He was just standing there, staring at the tap shoes, crying. Martinez called his supervisor and the police, then made his way to the exhibition hall. When he arrived, he found the man had somehow opened the supposedly secure display case. Later investigation would reveal he'd worked as a museum technician years earlier and knew the old lock systems. The man was holding Sammy's tap shoes against his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. "Sir," Martinez said carefully, "I need you to put those down and step away from the display." The man looked up with tear-streaked cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know this is wrong, but I promised her. I promised my little girl." His name was David Chen, and when the police arrived 10 minutes later, they expected to process a routine museum theft. Instead, they discovered a story that would change how the Smithsonian thought about its mission. David was 52 years old, a widowed father who'd been unemployed for 8 months since the factory where he worked had closed down. He'd been living in his car with his 9-year-old daughter, Emma, since they'd been evicted from their apartment in January. But that wasn't why he'd broken into the Smithsonian. 3 weeks earlier, Emma had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The doctors at Children's Hospital had explained that she needed immediate treatment, but even with insurance, the costs would be overwhelming for a man with no income. Emma was scared, confused, and facing months of chemotherapy, hospital stays, and uncertainty. But there was one thing that comforted her more than anything else: watching old videos of Sammy Davis Jr. David had discovered this by accident. One night, while staying at a homeless shelter that had a small TV in the common area, an old variety show was playing. Sammy was performing Mr. Bojangles, tap dancing with such joy and energy that it seemed to light up the room. Emma, who had been listless and depressed since her diagnosis, suddenly perked up. She watched Sammy's feet moving in those black tap shoes, creating rhythms that seemed to tell stories of their own. "Daddy," she said quietly, "he makes it look like dancing can fix anything." From that night on, Emma insisted on watching Sammy Davis Jr. videos whenever they could find them. At the library, David would help her look up clips online. She was fascinated by his tap dancing, the way he could make music with his feet, the way he smiled like he held some secret about happiness that he was sharing through his performances. "When I get better," Emma told her father, "I want to learn to dance like that. I want to make music with my feet too." But Emma wasn't getting better. The chemotherapy was harsh, and she was spending most of her time in the hospital. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but the treatment was taking a severe toll on a 9-year-old body. During one particularly difficult night in the hospital, after Emma had been throwing up for hours from the chemo, she looked at her father with exhausted eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, "do you think Mr. Sammy's tap shoes are real? Like, do they still exist somewhere?" David didn't know. "I imagine they're in a museum somewhere, sweetheart. Why?" Emma was quiet for a long moment. "I just think If I could touch them, if I could hold the shoes that made all that beautiful music, maybe they'd give me some of his strength. Maybe they'd help me get better. It was the kind of thing a sick 9-year-old might say, a magical thinking born of desperation and hope. David held her hand and promised he'd find out where Sammy's shoes were. That's how he learned about the Smithsonian exhibition. He'd called the museum and asked if there was any way Emma could see the shoes up close, maybe touch them. The person on the phone was sympathetic but explained that the artifacts couldn't be handled. They were too valuable, too historically significant. David tried to explain about Emma's illness, about how much Sammy's dancing meant to her, about her belief that the shoes might help her heal. But museum policy was clear. No touching the exhibits. 2 weeks later, Emma's condition worsened. She developed pneumonia as a side effect of the chemotherapy, and her immune system was so compromised that she couldn't have visitors. David could only watch through the window as his daughter fought for her life. During one of those long hospital vigils, Emma had asked him again about the shoes. "Did you find them, Daddy? Mr. Sammy's dancing shoes?" "Yes, sweetheart. They're in Washington, in a big museum." "Could we go see them when I get better?" David looked at his daughter, pale and thin, connected to machines, fighting a battle that no 9-year-old should have to fight. He thought about the medical bills piling up, the fact that he had no job and no home, the uncertainty of everything in their lives. But he looked into Emma's hopeful eyes and made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "Yes, baby. When you get better, we'll go see Mr. Sammy's shoes." The next morning, doctors told David that Emma had taken a turn for the worse. Her body wasn't responding to treatment the way they'd hoped. They weren't giving up, but David needed to prepare for the possibility that his daughter might not make it. That evening, sitting in the hospital parking lot in his car, David made a decision that he knew was wrong but felt necessary. If Emma couldn't come to the shoes, he'd bring the shoes to Emma. He'd driven from Baltimore to Washington, parked outside the Smithsonian, and waited until the museum closed. Using skills he'd learned during his 20 years as a museum maintenance technician, knowledge of building layouts, security systems, and display cases, he'd found a way inside. He wasn't thinking about the illegality of what he was doing. He wasn't considering the historical value of the artifacts or the museum's mission. He was thinking about his 9-year-old daughter, who believed that Sammy Davis Jr.'s tap shoes might give her the strength to live. Standing in front of the display case at 3 a.m., David had realized the magnitude of what he was attempting. These shoes had walked across stages with Frank Sinatra, had tap danced for presidents, had created joy for millions of people across decades. But they were also just shoes. Leather and metal that had been shaped by a man who understood something about perseverance, about entertaining people even when life was difficult, about finding joy in the midst of struggle. David thought about Sammy's own story, the poverty, the racism, the health problems, the career challenges. Sammy had faced his own battles and had used his art to transform pain into something beautiful. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe there was something in these shoes, some residual magic from all the joy they'd helped create, all the audiences they'd entertained, all the hope they'd generated. When security guard Martinez found him, David was holding the shoes and thinking about his daughter. "I know this is wrong," David told Martinez through his tears, "but my little girl is dying and she thinks these shoes might help her get better. I just wanted to bring them to her, to let her touch them, to give her some hope." Martinez, a father himself, felt something break in his chest. He'd been working security for 15 years and had dealt with all kinds of thefts and break-ins. But this wasn't about money or drugs or vandalism. This was about a desperate father trying to save his child with whatever means he had. When the police arrived, David didn't resist. He carefully placed Sammy's shoes back in their case and extended his hands for the handcuffs. "I know I was wrong," he told Officer Sarah Williams. "I know these belong to everyone, not just to me. But my daughter, she's 9 years old and she's dying, and she loves Sammy Davis Jr. so much. She thinks his shoes might give her strength." Officer Williams had heard a lot of explanations for criminal behavior during her 12 years on the force. But something about David's story, the way he talked about his daughter, the fact that he'd driven 4 hours to steal a pair of old tap shoes instead of something valuable, it didn't fit any pattern she knew. She called her supervisor and explained the situation. Within an hour, the story had reached Dr. Patricia Morrison, the director of the National Museum of American History. Dr. Morrison arrived at the museum at 5 a.m. to meet with David personally. "Tell me about Emma," she said, sitting across from him in the museum's administrative office. David told her everything. About Emma's love for Sammy's dancing, about her illness, about her belief that the shoes might help her heal, about the promise he'd made that he couldn't keep through legal channels. Dr. Morrison listened without judgment. When David finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Chen," she finally said, "what you did was illegal. You broke into a federal museum and attempted to steal an irreplaceable artifact." David nodded, resigned to whatever consequences were coming. "However," Dr. Morrison continued, "I think we can find a better solution." What happened next was unprecedented in the Smithsonian's history. Dr. Morrison called the museum's conservator and explained the situation. Within 2 hours, they had carefully removed Sammy's tap shoes from their display case and placed them in a special transport container. "We're going to Baltimore," Dr. Morrison told David. "You're going to take us to see Emma, and we're going to bring Sammy's shoes to her." The drive to Johns Hopkins Children's Hospital was surreal. David, who'd expected to be in jail, was instead in a museum vehicle with the director of one of the world's most prestigious institutions, transporting priceless artifacts to his dying daughter. When they arrived at the hospital, Dr. Morrison worked with the medical staff to ensure the visit would be safe for Emma's compromised immune system. The shoes were carefully cleaned and placed in a sterile container that could be opened in her room. Emma was awake but weak when David and Dr. Morrison entered her hospital room. Her eyes widened when she saw the container. "Are those?" Emma whispered. "These are Sammy Davis Jr.'s actual tap shoes," Dr. Morrison said gently. "The ones he wore when he danced on television, when he performed in Las Vegas, when he made all that beautiful music with his feet." With the doctor's permission and proper sterile precautions, Emma was allowed to hold the shoes. What happened next, according to everyone in the room, was magic. Emma, who had been listless and weak, suddenly sat up straighter. She examined the shoes carefully, running her small fingers over the worn leather, touching the metal taps that had created so much music. "They're warm," she said wonderingly, "and look, you can see where he danced. You can see the marks from all the stages." She held the shoes against her chest, closed her eyes, and smiled for the first time in weeks. "Mr. Sammy," she whispered to the shoes, "please help me be as strong as you were." Emma held the shoes for 20 minutes, asking Dr. Morrison questions about Sammy's life, his performances, his challenges. She seemed more alert and engaged than she'd been since starting treatment. When it was time to return the shoes to the museum, Emma carefully handed them back. "Thank you," she said to Dr. Morrison. "Thank you for letting me hold them. I can feel his strength now. I think I'm going to get better." The shoes were returned to their display case that evening, but with a new addition. Dr. Morrison had commissioned a special plaque that read, "These shoes have brought comfort and hope to visitors, including 9-year-old Emma Chen, reminding us that art and entertainment can heal in ways beyond our understanding." David was not prosecuted for the break-in. Instead, the Smithsonian hired him as a part-time consultant to help them develop new policies for making their collections more accessible to visitors with special needs. More importantly, Emma's condition began to improve dramatically after her encounter with Sammy's shoes. Whether it was coincidence, the power of positive thinking, or something more mysterious, her body started responding to treatment in ways that surprised her doctors. 6 months later, Emma was in remission. A year later, she was declared cancer-free. On the 2nd anniversary of her visit to the museum, Emma, now healthy and strong, returned to the Smithsonian. She stood in front of Sammy's display case and performed a tap dance routine she'd learned in the dance classes her father had enrolled her in once she recovered. The sound of her feet against the museum floor, creating the same kind of rhythm that Sammy's shoes had made for decades, echoed through the exhibition hall. Dr. Morrison, who had become a friend to both David and Emma, watched from nearby as the young girl danced in front of the case containing the shoes that had given her hope during her darkest time. "Thank you, Mr. Sammy," Emma said to the display when she finished her dance. "Thank you for sharing your strength with me. Today, the Smithsonian has a special program called Healing Through History, which allows seriously ill children and their families private access to artifacts that hold special meaning for them. The program was inspired by Emma's story and has brought comfort to hundreds of families facing medical crises. And every year on the anniversary of that March night in 1995, David and Emma returned to visit Sammy's shoes. Emma, now a professional dancer and dance teacher, always performs a short routine in front of the display case, sharing the joy that Sammy's art gave her during the most difficult time of her life. The shoes remain in their case, protected and preserved for future generations. But thanks to one desperate father's love and a museum director's compassion, they've become more than historical artifacts. They've become symbols of hope, healing, and the power of art to touch lives in ways we don't always understand. If this incredible story of desperate love, institutional compassion, and the healing power of art moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to remember that sometimes the most valuable things can't be measured in money, but in the hope they provide. Have you ever been touched by a piece of art or history in a way that changed your life? Let us know in the comments about the moments when culture and creativity provided comfort during difficult times. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the intersection of art, healing, and human compassion.